Hello and welcome back to this damn Palladialistic Crusade. This video is a review of the lovely Eureka triple feature of Universal horror and horror adjacent titles and monster films, which goes under the title of Three Monster Tales of Sci-Fi Terror, which brings together the 1941 unheralded classic Universal B sci-fi programmer Man-Made Monster, which was very important for really bringing Lon Chaney Jr. into the horror film world of Universal, and of course George Wagner as well. And then we have two of Universal's 1950s science fiction and monster films, and 1957's The Monolith Monsters, and 1958's Monster on the Campus, which was directed by Jack Arnold, who was one of the key architects of 50s science fiction / horror at Universal. So this follows in the wake of Eureka's other releases of Universal titles in and around and adjacent to the horror canon. So it's much like those in that it brings together three films or more in a sort of themed package with a nice limited edition slipcover, custom artwork, and booklet, but also with a new set of extras to directly compete with US releases from Shout Factory and Kino Lorber. So it's left up to the individual fan to figure out which release you want to go for, and of course if you have the budget and you're a big enough fan, you would probably want to pick up both the US and UK releases for all of the extras. Usually the Eureka sets, I think, are the better option. They're usually a bit cheaper than the Shout Factory Universal Horror volumes, and also they usually have better encoding, nicer packaging, and their own wonderful nice extras. However, here on this set in particular, talking about the two 50s science fiction films, because they were also intended for a widescreen ratio and there's some ratio debate on those, I do think it might be important for those two films to have the US releases, not just for their extras, but for their use of the 1:8:5 ratio, as opposed to what is technically accurate according to Universal documentation at the time, and their favoring of the 2.0:1 ratio, which is what Eureka went with for the widescreen versions of the 250s films. But as I'll discuss a little bit later, I think even though that's technically accurate, I think they're a little bit tight in the framing, and I think 1:8:5 would have been a better option, which is what's on the US releases. So the first film is Man-Made Monster, and this is a complete Universal programmer right down to the fact that it clocks in at a ridiculously brisk and short 59 minutes and a few seconds. So it clocks in at just under an hour, and you might think that there's no way a film this short, and that was obviously a B film, could be entertaining or super rewarding, and obviously is going to have some things that are not fully developed in terms of subplots that will hold it back some. And while Man-Made Monster obviously does have some subplots and things that are not developed enough or as developed as you would wish, it is a ridiculously entertaining, investing, and honestly a great little gem in Universal horror, and is the film that really brought us both Lon Chaney Jr. and George Wagner as the director into the fold of Universal horror. And in some ways, not only does this mean it leads to The Wolfman, amazingly made and released in the same year of 1941 as this film, but it even has some plot similarities. So you can actually look at Man-Made Monster and see the first inklings of The Wolfman. And of course, the success of this film led the director and one of the lead actors in this film to going and making their most iconic film in the same year. So without this film, you wouldn't really have The Wolfman, so that alone makes it important. But it's a great little film to begin with that is so rewarding to come back to, and its runtime actually enhances this because it manages to have a certain energy that is maintained throughout. And ironic that I'm mentioning energy, because the film's plot revolves around the Lon Chaney Jr. character, who is a man with a carnival sideshow act where he's able to display his body's natural ability to handle electricity to a certain degree. And the opening has a rather nicely staged bus crash sequence where he's pretty much the only survivor, because the bus crashes into power lines and everyone else is electrocuted to death. This brings him to the attention of a particular scientist played by Samuel S. Hines, who has always dabbled with electricity in his experiments and wants to do some general tests on the Chaney character, and in terms of learning more about his body's natural immunity and resistance to electricity. This is all fine and dandy, and Chaney actually has what I think is probably his most natural and affable, comfortable performance in a film in the opening sections. He very much seems like he's at ease in the role and is very likable and charming. And there's a whole subplot that starts here about his relationship with the pet dog at the scientist's residence, and also his interactions with the scientist's daughter, and then her eventual romantic interest. You would wish the film had kind of developed that as a sort of love triangle, but there's no time for that because there's only 59 minutes for the runtime. But there's at least a little tinge of that. I think it's the daughter and the character of the love interest of the reporter, and the sort of hints at maybe there being some romantic interest with the Cheney character in this love triangle that never comes to fruition. I think this is the one element that does not ever get fully realized, and that's probably what you can immediately kind of pick up on. But there's enough there, and there's so little runtime to play with that it's understandable that gets kept on the back burner. But Cheney Jr.'s poor Dan McCormick is not long for this world when we are introduced to the scientist's main assistant, who works and lives under his shadow. The assistant is Dr. Regas, played by Lionel Atwill, and as soon as Atwill appears, you know that he is going to be utilizing Cheney's poor character for his own mad scientific dreams. And in spite of all the positives of this film, what makes it an absolute gem and what makes it a universal classic and one of the best B films they ever produced in their horror cycles is Lionel Atwill's performance. He is absolutely deliriously entertaining in this film. He's swinging for the fences, he's playing the mad doctor to the hilt, but also keeping it contained and only letting it out in little bursts at first. But when he especially gets going in his crazy monologues and his mad dreams about eventually creating a super race of human batteries to do all of the menial work and different things, you can't help but read all kinds of horrible connotations into that. And it's a fascinating character, worthy of its own 2-hour feature film, and I've always been a giant Atwill fan, but he just comes into this film and just immediately, forgive the pun, gives it that jolt of electricity. And then, of course, he gets to start experimenting on Dan McCormick, and you see Cheney Jr.'s performance as this man who is physically and mentally deteriorating, even though he's not supposed to be. And you would think that other people might catch on to the fact that suddenly he looks like he's on death's door, and is only ever enlivened by the thought of getting another treatment in this experiment, which is just supposed to be a study. And of course, it is Atwill's evil doctor who is bringing him closer and closer and closer to being a walking human energy robot that completely operates under the Atwill Mad Doctor's will. And of course, things go downhill from there. And because the film has a brief runtime, it's not long before we're at the climax where Cheney's McCormick is in full monster mode. And interestingly, we get another nod to another Universal horror film, because John P. Fulton, effects genius, gets to revisit his invisible ray glowing effect that he did for Boris Karloff in The Invisible Ray. Well, here, when Cheney is literally the man-made monster of the title, he has the glowing effect, and it's beautifully done. In fact, it's technically superior to the first iteration in The Invisible Ray. So it's kind of like when Fulton got to come back and do Invisible Man sequels, he would continually get better at the process. So you can see that here, and you can see how it's improved. And this is also combined with a really great makeup job under Jack Pierce of suggesting Cheney's deterioration physically, and you can see underneath the glowing effect, like the skin on his face is also deteriorating. So it's a nice physical manifestation of what's going on, and also it gives Cheney something to play, even when he's in the monster mode, if you will, essentially being controlled by Dr. Regas's will and sort of lumbering around. There's still a sense of pathos and a pitiable quality, in addition to him being the horrifying monster of the title. Dr. Regas also has him commit some convenient murders, and then allows him to be the fall guy. So then the film kind of turns into being a wrong man on trial for a little bit, which then gets us to the climax of the monster fully running rampant. And probably the most morbidly amusing part of this film is that McCormick is sentenced to die in the electric chair. And so we get the wonderful, very morbid idea of they can't kill him because he just keeps sucking up the energy. As the commentary points out, unfortunately, we don't get to see this, but we do get the wonderful visual of the voltage meter on at the prison constantly just shooting up and then going down because he's just taking all the energy. And that's not really a spoiler because you can see where this film is going because it's only 59 minutes long, and there's only so much you can do in that amount of time with a B programmer film that's already building towards a predestined end and is a Universal horror film adapting some of the tropes of the Universal horror style, and you still have a monster character lumbering around. So you know where this is headed. It's not full of any great surprises in terms of how the plot actually ends. It's how it gets there. And when Lionel Atwill shows up, that we just go into full glory classic horror fan nirvana. So this is, without question, one of the best B programmer horror films Universal ever made. In terms of the films that were designed as programmers, this is pretty much the peak of them. It's only 59 and a half minutes long. It's well paced, it's well acted, well shot, well put together, extraordinarily efficient, well directed by George Wagner, and it was so successful that this is really what led to The Wolfman, because that was handled by George Wagner and starred Lon Chaney Jr., and that was the film that made him a horror icon. But without Man-Made Monster, you wouldn't get The Wolfman. And again, it does have some sort of fascinating story parallels in that Lon Chaney Jr. in both films is playing a character who goes to a particular location where he's welcomed at first and is transformed into an unstoppable, monstrous force. But the star here is Lionel Atwill. I mean, he mesmerizes you as an audience member. There's not a facet of his performance that is not hypnotic and fascinating and deliriously entertaining. It's essentially a role that has elements of his ridiculously wicked and psychotic, deliriously insane character in the pre-code horror classic Murders in the Zoo, and the duplicitous other fellow scientist in the shadow of his more famous employer in the later Ghost of Frankenstein. So, if you know his Dr. Boehmer there in Ghost of Frankenstein, this is the precursor to that, but here he is the star, and that's what makes this film glorious. It's a film that should be more discussed, better seen, and it's an absolute treasure of the Universal horror canon, and it's one of the best Universal horror films they ever made, even though it's a 59 and a half minute B programmer through and through. This is a delight. This is a joy to return to every time. And without this film, you simply would not have The Wolfman. But it's Lionel Atwill's film 1000%. And if you're an Atwill fan, this is an absolute must. If you love Mad Doctor characters, this is an absolute must. And Lon Chaney Jr. gets a nice standout role that basically got him The Wolfman. In terms of the picture quality, this is another Universal preservation master of sorts. There's no tech info on this release for the transfer materials that were used. However, like all these Universal masters, regardless of their age, it is a huge step up over the old DVD. But here, I think they were probably using the same source as that old DVD master. This is from an element that does have some inherent wear and damage, so this is not a painstaking restoration. Unfortunately, there's not really the time, budget, or interest to give the rest of the lesser discussed Universal horror canon the same treatment as a 4K master and more painstaking restoration work as the big name titles and the Universal monster films, for example. But this film certainly deserves it, and hopefully someday that happens. However, this is still a huge upgrade over the old DVD, but do expect some occasional bits of wear, some occasional scratches and frame movement, and some occasional light lines and things poking in. Some bits and tiny sequences do seem a bit darker, and there is some fluctuation in the transfer, but it all seems to be inherent to the original element they were transferring, and it's obviously not the original negative, because this film was very popular and reissued many times, even in the 1950s under a different title of The Atomic Monster, to try and modernize it for the 1950s atomic age. But it's seen a lot of wear through the years. You will see that in this master, but it does look overall rather healthy and is a big improvement over the old DVD. So it was an absolute treat getting to return to this absolute gem in 1080p. You should also expect that during the actual glowing effect sequences, anytime there's any sort of optical, you're going to have some drop in the quality. Some of these sequences do look a little bit softer or at a different sort of level simply due to it having effects work going on. And there are one or two shots or sequences that look a little softer or darker, especially in the ending sequences, but that's how it was on the DVD, and it seems to be inherent to the element they're working from. Now, the audio is here, the original mono mix and lossless quality. It sounds nice and healthy. It does have some occasional bursts of additional hiss and some audio defects that seem inherent to the source, but they are more on the minor side, and it sounds pretty much how the old DVD sounded from what I remember. So it sounds very much like what you would expect a 1941 B programmer to sound in terms of source limitations and things. And also part of the charm of this film is also recognizing holdovers and other things from Universal horror films before this point and afterwards, right down to musical cues repeated and in this film from previous Universal films, and then musical cues also reused from this film in later films. And of course, some of the props and things. The house is seemingly the one from The Invisible Woman. The operating table is seemingly the same table from Son of Frankenstein. So you can very much spot the Universal horror source here. Now, in terms of the supplements, we have another brand new commentary for this release, as Eureka does for all of these Universal horror sets, and they usually have the same team pairing. So this has Kim Newman and Stephen Jones come back and do another commentary for one of these releases, and they love this film as much as I do, which is great. This is another of their must-listen, extremely informative commentaries, and it's also wonderful to hear other people who really love this film and praise all of its incredible strengths. So they talk about the development of the film, the casting process, what this meant for both Atwill and Lon Chaney Jr.'s careers, and for George Wagner, and how this obviously led to The Wolfman later in the year. And also they talk about it being ridiculously effective for a film that runs under an hour. Also some things that might have been trimmed from the original, slightly longer edited version to get to that under hour runtime. And the fact that it's a Universal B programmer and it's new Universal cranking out horror films on a sort of assembly line without the intensive artistry of the original Universal horror films of the 30s. They get into all kinds of production details, and also that this story actually started life as an intended Karloff and Lugosi vehicle in the 30s, but it was deemed too similar to The Invisible Ray of 1936, which was where Fulton first did the glowing effect on Karloff in that film. So it makes sense why they decided to shelve it, and eventually this project was dusted off and developed into this film, Man-Made Monster, as just a B programmer instead of a Karloff Lugosi vehicle. So it's fascinating hearing about a Karloff Lugosi film that got away, but you can also understand that it was so similar to Invisible Ray that that's why it got shelved for a while. So it's another great commentary track from one of these releases, exclusive to the Eureka set, and a great listen. We get another stills gallery with wonderful production stills, posters, lobby cards, some of the older home video release artwork for the VHS tape, and also, interestingly, we get images of the Real Art reissue of this film, which changed the title to The Atomic Monsters. So you can see how they tried to resell the film for the Atomic Age and get that visual of the revised artwork with the new title. Unfortunately, there is no trailer, which does happen for a lot of the Universal horror films. Some have trailers that survive, and unfortunately some don't, or at least not on this release. Next in this set is 1957's The Monolith Monsters, and this is where we go into full Universal 1950s science fiction territory. However, this is towards the tail end of the era, being in 1957, after Universal had big successes with, starting primarily with It Came from Outer Space, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Revenge of the Creature, Tarantula, and The Incredible Shrinking Man, all directed by Jack Arnold, who has a story credit on this film but didn't direct it. And I think that's why this film feels a little different, because it doesn't have the same sort of energy that I think Jack Arnold brought to those films that were the big major success successes and made Universal really focus on science fiction films over horror, as most studios were doing in the 50s when we had the sort of 50s sci-fi boom sparked by the atomic age. But here in Monolith Monsters, even though I think the film would have benefited from Jack Arnold as a more energetic director to get some more energy into the pacing, it's a rather remarkable film because the alien menace, or the force that is menacing this small town, is not a defined physical intelligence. It's not a monster. It's not giant radiated animals or insects of some type. And it's not aliens or monsters. It's literally rocks. You might think that sounds like a stupid idea for a film and something that sounds so inherently dumb and goofy that nobody could take it with a straight face. However, this is a film and a story handled with a good deal of intelligence and presents a threat that actually is quite believable and very striking in a very cold, chilling kind of way, because there's not any sort of intelligent presence behind the threat. It's just an incredibly ominous one. But essentially, this film deals with a falling meteorite that strikes the Earth and spreads itself all over the desert surrounding a small town. And this meteorite takes to Earth so much that when it gets wet or any type of water or moisture is applied, the rocks start growing uncontrollably, and as they grow, will of course threaten to completely not only destroy humanity, but take over the world, simply due to the fact that they are unstoppable, and they can grow into gigantic pillars in the sky of these gigantic monolith pieces that then continue to fall and crack under gravity and pile up under more rubble, and of course make more rocks that can then grow uncontrollably. If that were not enough, we have another fascinating subplot that the rocks devour all of the certain minerals in not just the ground, but also living objects. So people who come into contact with them are literally turned to stone or petrified. So it's a fascinating idea. It has the horror movie conceit of what can be done to people, and we do see this happen in the opening, and the whole development of the monolith and the rocks as an opposing force is developed over time, and our characters have to follow a sort of trail of breadcrumbs and put two and two together and solve the mystery, and then once they do, figure out how to even stop said rocks. The issue with this is it becomes quite apparent to the audience very quickly what is going on, and it seems to take our characters in the film quite a bit longer to put two and two together. So there is a little degree of that in most any sci-fi film of the 50s with this type of plot setup, but here it's a little different and a little bit more intelligent than usual, because you've got a completely unique force that they're fighting against. Here, I think the real standout in terms of the performances is the lead scientist, played by Grant Williams, who is terribly underrated and had just performed for Jack Arnold in the iconic The Incredible Shrinking Man, where he really outdid himself in an incredible performance that, no pun intended, that really remains a highlight of 1950s cinema. And that film is not only Jack Arnold's great science fiction classic masterwork, but the best science fiction film Universal ever made, and one of the most iconic science fiction films of all time. The Monolith Monsters is not that, but it does have intelligence to it. And I think that Grant Williams, while he's playing a straightforward scientist here, he's also playing a normal scientist. He's not an expert in anything. He's a small town scientist, but he approaches everything with rationality and believability, and he has a certain realism in his performance that I think helps to elevate everyone else around him and infect the each scene with a believability. So I think he's the one really bringing the energy on screen, and that sort of brings that out of the other actors, because this film does kind of move along at a very methodical pace. So it does, unfortunately, kind of plod along a little bit, and it does feel like it runs a little bit long, and then the climax with all of the final action and the rocks growing uncontrollably and threatening the small town, it does feel maybe a tiny bit rushed, but that's pretty much what you're going to find in all 50s science fiction films. They all kind of have a degree of that. But here, I think this is why the film would have benefited from having Jack Arnold direct it. And he was supposed to direct it, but for various reasons wound up not directing it, but only getting a sort of story credit for helping to kind of suggest the basic idea or work on it a little bit. But I think that was also to use his name for marketing purposes. But I think had Arnold directed this, it would have given the film a little bit more vigor, which I do think it needs in terms of the pacing. However, it's still an impressive film, and it's done intelligently enough that it never goes into dumb or hokey territory, which in most hands it would have, because you've got people running away from rocks and being worried about a room full of rocks and giant rocks and more giant rocks. So this could be really dumb, and it could be really hokey, and it could be really stupid. And I think the best aspect of this film is that it manages to make the giant rocks actually a credible threat and build some levels of suspense to where you're actually involved in people running away from and worrying about a bunch of rocks. So there's also a sort of ecological concern here, and that you see in some 50s sci-fi that's also very fascinating, about the environmental concerns of what this will do to the planet, and how that's the big concern here, not just the fact that it can destroy humanity and turn everybody to stone. I do wish there was more with the subplot of people being turned to stone. That's always such a fascinating idea and a very interesting horror element. That's, of course, even going all the way back to Greek mythology. Horror films rarely deal with that, so I just thought it was interesting to see that here, and I wish there was more done with it. But this is an above average 50 science fiction film. It does feel, coming at 1957, there had been so many sci-fi films to this point, and some that had really pushed the boundaries of a sci-fi film. So this is still a very studio-bound film. It was shot on the Universal backlot on a budget. The overall photography is a bit flat, and it's obviously the same Universal small town backlot set that you see in many films, even, of course, in Back to the Future. So it's a very familiar locale. But I think the film uses the desert locations very well and mixes everything to at least give it some sense of the outside world and not just be completely studio bound. So I find this film very impressive to come back to. It's far better than the elements that make it up, really, and it manages to make the giant rocks a relatively credible threat. And again, I think Grant Williams is really great in this film, as in pretty much any film he appears in. I think he's an incredibly underrated actor to this day, and it's a shame he never got a greater shot at stardom. But this is definitely an underrated film in the Universal 50s sci-fi canon. It's just, I think it could have done with a little bit more energetic pacing that I think Jack Arnold might have brought to it. But just because this is not Jack Arnold and it's giant rocks doesn't mean that you should write it off, because it is a science fiction film made with a good deal of intelligence. The characters behave rather realistically, and it thus adds a layer of believability, and you don't have any of the hokiness that would probably come from people worrying about a bunch of rocks. Now, to move on to the picture quality of this release, as I alluded to before, I do have a little bit of a quibble about the aspect ratio. This is presented in the ratio of 2.0 to 1, which was on paper the house widescreen ratio for Universal in the 1950s, and in more recent years, Universal has been actually framing their HD masters of their non-scope films in this ratio on disc. They have also applied it to some films, like some of the Hammer films they handle, and that, of course, is inaccurate for those films. So those presentations of films not composed for this ratio are way too heavily cropped and too tight and should not be shown that way. This is one of those cases where the framing is still fine, and that's what it was supposed to be on paper, but it is a little bit tight in the overall presentation. There is a little bit of that feeling throughout the film, and you wish it had a little bit more breathing room. So I think this is one of those films where, though it might be 2.0 to 1 on paper, I think 1.85 to 1 in terms of a widescreen ratio is a much better choice. And that's actually the option you get on the US Shout Factory Blu-ray release. So this is one of those cases where I do think it's advisable to have that release as well, not just for the extras, but I do think that 2.0 to 1 is a little bit tight. It still looks perfectly fine, but if you're like me and you're big on studying composition and you're really knowledgeable about framings, and you've noticed this in some Universal films and a lot of films where they put this 2.0 to 1 ratio on and it's still matting, that frequently it looks a little tight. And for the most part, the film fares quite well, but especially when you have the big shots of the wonderful effect shots of the giant monolith monsters of the title, the big rocks going up into the sky, it does really hurt those shots a little tiny bit, because I think it's just it needs a little bit more headroom, especially. And there are some instances in the film where you've got some dialogue scenes and you see some people's heads getting trimmed a little bit. It's never bad, but it makes you wish that there was a 1.85 option on this disc, and unfortunately there isn't. Before this point, the film would be shown on home video all the way open at 1.33 to 1, and you'd see tons of headroom and stuff that you weren't meant to see, but they at least did protect for a 1.33 presentation for television airings. And we'll talk about this more with the next film, which actually does give an alternative ratio presentation, although again, you unfortunately don't get a 1.85 choice like you do on the US Shout Factory Blu-ray. So this is a case where for both of the 50s films in this set, while I think the whole presentation and disc encoding is better here, I do think the Shout Factory Blu-rays not only have great extras to them, but they do have a preferable 1.85 framing. But that's just my own feeling on the subject. You may think differently or not notice an issue with the ratio at all, but this is one of those cases where, in spite of it being 2.0 to 1 on paper, I think it's just a little too tight. Overall, this seems to be an older Universal Master. It's still quite solid, but you can tell it's obviously not a new scan, and of course it's also a very studio-based film, so it has a flatter look to it to begin with. But overall, it's a rather healthy presentation in 1080p. You will notice some occasional fleeting bits of damage, like an occasional slight mark or a speck that might appear here and there, but nothing major. There's maybe a tiny flash of frame wobble, but really only once or twice. And then you will notice that, and of course, the matte shots on the opticals, and anytime you've got the big shots of the giant rocks coming up out of the ground, it's obviously a little bit softer. Or in the long shots of the town with the rocks threatening in the distance, it's of course a matte shot, so that's going to be a bit softer. The opening sequence with the wonderful sort of Paul Frees narration setting up the film is dupe stock footage, so that of course is of lesser quality, and seeing it here in 1080p makes it quite stand out that some of that footage is actually alternate takes and I guess outtakes from the opening of It Came from Outer Space. So that always looks familiar, and if you ever wondered where it came from, it is indeed from the opening sequence of It Came from Outer Space. So that's a bit easier to spot here, but of course, being dupe footage, it's a little lesser quality as well. But on the whole, it's a pretty solid older Universal Master. I think a new scan would obviously improve things, but thankfully this is pretty solid, and most of the older Universal Masters for their 50s sci-fi films are solid like this, so you can bump them up to 1080p and they'll look just fine. For the audio, we have the original mono mix in lossless quality, and it sounds relatively healthy for a film of this era and being an older master. It is a little limited due to the actual source and this not being a big prestige film, obviously, so it sounds a little thin and maybe boxy at times, and you do get a little bit of light background hiss. It doesn't seem like it's been over manipulated like crazy, but I've only seen this film on the old DVD before, and this seems like pretty much the same source, except it's just in a different ratio and in 1080p, and now the audio is in lossless quality. There are one or two source defects, so there are a couple light pops and ticks throughout, but nothing particularly major. I've just not seen a version of this film that's seemingly not from this source, because again, this seems like the same source and perhaps even the same master as what was struck for the DVD years ago, just now in 1080p with a different ratio. Of course, you have to expect some distortion in the loudest music passages, as is common to a track of this era, and some of the dialogue gets a little thin and harsh at points, but it doesn't become grating or anything, but you will notice that. In terms of the supplements, we have a new commentary track, again from Kevin Lyons and Jonathan Rigby, who have a good appreciation for this film. They talk about its pluses and minuses, and they talk about its production. They talk about what Jack Arnold's actual involvement may have been with the credit he has for original story. It doesn't seem to really be all that much, and probably not really deserving of a credit. But they also talk about director John Sherwood and how this film really differs from pretty much every other 50s science fiction film, simply due to the fact that you have people fighting giant rocks, and it's got a particular intelligence to it and a particular methodical pace that also helps to further separate it from the rest of the 50s science fiction film pack. And it's done so with a good level of quality thought put into it, and it's nice to hear that highlighted in the commentary. And both critics are big fans of this film. They also talk about some of the inherent humor that pops up rarely, and the niceness of the special effects, and Grant Williams' performance being the real standout. So it's a really great commentary track and very engaging, very much worth your time, as are all of this pair's tracks. And it's nice to have the same people return for all of these different Eureka commentaries and sort of alternate, but really lovely to hear them talk so positively about this film. Then we also have a nice image gallery once again, with loads of production stills, original poster artwork, lobby cards, and then some of the home video artwork. And if you're really curious about what the old 133 fully opened up transfers may have looked like, we have the original trailer here. And while it's an old standard def file that's been upscaled and unfortunately has a lot of aliasing on the titles in the trailer, it looks pretty solid for an old standard of upscale trailer, but it's also in the 1:3 aspect ratio. So you can see what the framing would look like on, say, an old video release of this film without any widescreen matting. And you can see that while it's protected for that and still looks pretty good, it's no longer cramped on the top, because again, it's not over matted in the 2.0 to 1 where things are a little tight feeling, but you've got miles of headroom above everybody's heads, so you've got all this dead space. So it's kind of amusing to see that there. So if you're curious more about the frame, you can actually look at the 133 trailer on this disc and get an idea of what this film was like completely open. So overall, the Monolith Monsters is quite a fascinating 50s science fiction film from Universal that is very much atypical of the typical science fiction product, and also has a believably done storyline that is actually going to make you believe in the danger and imminent threat of giant growing rocks. And that factor alone, and pulling that off and making it believable and not something you're laughing at, I think that alone elevates this film over a lot of its competition, and it's also intelligently done. So that those factors are what make this film a little bit special. And again, the effects are quite well done for the rocks themselves, and because they're really there and physically happening in front of you, that only adds to the ominous quality of those sequences, even though it's obviously miniatures being done. It's just a really effective science fiction programmer from this time, and far better than you'd think it would be. So to move on to the final film in the set, it's 1958's Monster on the Campus, which is an interesting film, and it's also it's got a lot of different things going on here. This is directed by Jack Arnold, who is basically the key director of Universal in the 1950s, who directed their major science fiction hits and was supposed to have directed Monolith Monsters, but wound up doing something else, and then coming to this film, which he didn't particularly want to do, but Universal just basically asked him to do it, and he said, okay. It is very much a film that seems to be designed to cash in on the new emerging trend that American International was having a great success with, of teenage horror films. And they had already done I Was a Teenage Werewolf, and it seems very much the film that Monster on the Campus was basing itself off of. This is a lower budgeted film that is entirely studio bound, and they set it on a college campus. But instead of having a teenager turning into a werewolf, you have an aging college professor played by Arthur Franz, due to his experimentation with a coelacanth, which is actually replicated quite well, even though it looks like a gigantic prehistoric fish. Apparently these things do actually exist, but it does look a little goofy in terms of the prop that he's having to handle. But due to getting a cut when handling said fish and getting its blood contaminating said wound, it causes him to essentially revert back to a sort of primordial caveman Neanderthal type man who then wreaks havoc at various intervals whenever the professor gets in contact with the coelacanth blood. It's very much a monster film. You get exactly what you expect here, but it's also extremely low budget feeling, extremely studio bound, and it's obvious the market that Universal was going for here. It's just very disheartening that this was the last genre film that Jack Arnold made for the studio, and was not too terribly long before he actually left Universal. And it's kind of a shame. This is what he went out on in terms of being really the key science fiction director of the 1950s in terms of Hollywood releases. And to compare this to the last genre film he made, which was The Incredible Shrinking Man, which is a masterpiece of the genre. It's one of the biggest night and day differences in two genre films back to back by the same director you're ever likely to see. This is very much it's very much a product from Universal, and again, they're obviously trying to go after the market that American International started to really cultivate with mixing films geared for teenagers with the horror genre. And this film doesn't have any of the charm or the low budget quirkiness and the inherent sort of rebelliousness of the American International films. And again, it kind of hurts it that it's trying to go for that market, but we're focusing more on an older, aging college professor instead of the teen character here, played by Troy Donahue in a sort of thankless part as the young college student who keeps running into these strange occurrences and looking very perplexed. He's just kind of there. It's also a film that is very dependent, shall we say, on coincidences to get another sort of monster sequence. And some of those are so completely unbelievable that you will literally groan when seeing this film. They even do it in the commentary. There's one in particular where it's just so unbelievably stupid that I cannot help but facepalm and groan out loud every time I see this film again. And I think you can feel Jack Arnold doing some of the same things and how dumb this script is at times. But he does try to give the film some energy, and this is reflected in a lot of the performances, which are all fine, but particularly the lead performances do try to get something out of this. You can sense that everybody's trying to get some mileage out of this rather unfortunately dull story with a really goofy, stupid premise that essentially anything that comes into contact with the blood from this coelacanth fish is somehow going to revert to a giant bestial version of itself. And interestingly, we don't see any of this monster creature. It's always off screen, and we don't actually see it until the very end. And by the end of this film, if you weren't already aware, this is the end of Universal Horror. If you want to include the science fiction films, it's at the tail end of the Universal Sci-Fi films. And if you wanted to count all of these together, Universal Horror and science fiction really only lasts until about 1960 with The Leech Woman. So it's at the very end of all of the cycles. And the fact that this film is so low budget and cheap filling and studio bound and frequently looks very flat, and we don't even see a monster character until the last act of the film, when we basically turn into a just completely threadbare remake of the Wolfman, right down to having lap dissolves and a pullover mask that looks like a horribly pale imitation of the Wolfman iconic Jack Pierce makeup, that it really rubs in that this is just the tail end of everything Universal Horror used to be. And again, the ending is basically, it just turns into a low budget riff on the Wolfman, and that leaves a bad taste in the mouth for sure. However, there are some interesting things here. There are some elements that do spark the interest, and there's also a lot of stills showing a different makeup and design for this creature, this Neanderthal man, that suggests that they didn't use it in the film, or they cut it out for some reason, because it's a significantly different makeup, perhaps suggesting that the first transformations are not quite as bestial and more, perhaps a little more more ape-like in things. So that would have added an interesting element to this film that I wish was here, because what we have is a director trying to give a really inherently goofy and threadbare script some energy and dressing up, and that you see some of that in the lead performances a little bit. And while there are some interesting ideas and things, it's a shame that it was designed to just be a basic product, and that this was the last Jack Arnold genre film for Universal. And this is what he went out in terms of science fiction and horror on for at the studio after all the great films and important films he made leading up to this point. And also, this is the tail end of Universal horror in general, if you count the science fiction films, because there's really only one or two after this point. And it's a shame that this is towards the tail end, and it's so just riffing on the Wolfman at the end, as if somebody decided to do a cheap 1950s Wolfman knockoff, except it was Universal doing it. You've also got an incredible couple of names in the crew. If you look at the credit listing, one in particular really is surprising as a holdover from the original iconic days of Universal horror. If you needed another reminder that this was the end, or getting towards the very end of everything, this was edited by Ted Kent, who was James Whale's favorite editor, and cut The Invisible Man and Bride of Frankenstein and even The Wolfman. He cut many of the classic Universal horrors, so it's at least edited pretty well, but it just underlines the fact, along with the really poor looking pullover mask that we have to wait the whole film for, that this is Universal just cranking out something in 1958. The other notable name is this film was shot by Russell Meddy, one of the legendary cinematographers, in the same year that he shot Touch of Evil at Universal. So let that sink in, that in the same year he's also having to photograph Monster on the Campus. And I swear there's at least one moment where you get a fleeting feeling or a reminder of Touch of Evil, because there's an interrogation by some cops in a room that's been torn apart, where our lead characters are being interrogated after the first off-screen death and murder from an unseen force that we know, quite frankly, is the transformed Neanderthal man, even though that's not confirmed until, the very end of the movie. It's painfully obvious what's going on. But the way the staging is done in that scene, and there are some different angles and things, you can't help but remember this is the same cameraman who shot the police interrogation scene in Touch of Evil in the same year. You also have the different aspect ratios in play here, which I'll talk about a little bit more, which of course Touch of Evil does as well. But all of this is to a much lesser degree, because this film was cranked out really fast on a threadbare budget, and it was meant to just make a quick return. So there's no artistic flourishes here. This is Monster on the Campus, but I just find it absolutely crazy to think that you have Russell Meddy shooting this film in the same year that he shot the mind-blowing visuals of Touch of Evil. So let that one sink in. Ultimately, this is an odd, total mixed bag of a film. Yes, it has many dumb things in it. Yes, it is a complete product. It's hokey. It's goofy in the wrong kind of ways. It's frequently dumb to the point of groaning and facepalming. But it does still have a kind of charm, and I think that's got to be entirely down to Jack Arnold trying to inject some spirit into this film that he didn't even want to make. And everybody in the cast and crew does seem to have at least tried to give it some energy, but it's just not there in the script. So ultimately, I think it's surprising the film is as effective as it is and doesn't completely leave a sour taste. It's not a film I actually dislike, but it's not a film I'm looking forward to frequently returning to. It is very much a product of trying to go for a different market, and it is very, very studio bound and flat looking, and was shot very quickly. And to say the science in the film is dodgy is an understatement. But I think it's Jack Arnold and everybody trying to elevate this however they could, that does at least earn some audience goodwill, and instead of it being just a completely forgettable piece of product. There is a lot of modern critical reading on the film that you'll see addressed, where they talk about how fascinating it is that it's the college professor that's reverting, and so you have a figure of authority who is essentially embracing primordial instincts and throwing off said authority, and that it's also societal criticism. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine and dandy. It's an interesting way to look at this film, but also this film is dumber than a bag of rocks. So not to insult the Monolith Monsters, but there's so much dumb stuff here that, yeah, that was not on anybody's minds. I can tell you that for sure, even though I wasn't there. I mean, it's plainly obvious. So that's a nice sort of critical theory, and it is a particular way you can look at this film with a more serious study. But no, that was not. The Monster on the Campus is not designed for that. It was merely cranked out as a product, and while I think it comes up way too short, it at least does attain some audience goodwill, and you can return to it and enjoy its inherent goofiness, should you wish to, here on this Blu-ray presentation. Now, Monster on the Campus, to talk about the picture quality, this is presented on disc 2 by itself because Eureka has given us 2 different ratios. Again, to get into the whole 2.0 to 1 debate, that is the ratio used here for the widescreen version, which is the correct ratio on paper. However, just like Monolith Monsters, it is a little bit tight, and I would prefer having a 1.85 option, which is what you get on the Shout Factory release here. The other presentation is a completely open 1:3:3 to 1 ratio, which looks really solid, and of course the film was protected for that, and this is how it was shown on all older video releases. But you can definitely tell it was not meant to be seen this way, because it was shot well by Russell Meddy in a very quick schedule, even though it looks flat as heck by being studio bound. But the fact is, there's miles and miles and miles of headroom and dead space on the top of the frame. It was not meant to be seen this way. You can imagine me sitting here talking into my camera right now, but imagine you could see, like 5 feet of the wall behind me above my head and all this dead space. So it's plainly obvious the film was not meant to be seen this way. It was just protected. So if Eureka was going to give us an alternate option, I wish they would have given us a 1.85 to 1, because this film is definitely a bit too tight for sure in 2.0 to 1, and you get frequent trimmed hair and trimmed off and lopped off heads and things, and especially in close-ups you can tell it's just a bit too tight. But it is, again, you have Russell Meddy shooting this, so it looks as good as it possibly could be for being a low-budget studio product in 1958, cranked out and being very studio-bound and very flat-looking and not leaving anybody any room for artistic flourishes, really. So in terms of the ratio, I think 1.85 is the best compromise, and that's why I think the Shout Blu-ray is important. However, Shout Blu-rays are almost never as well encoded as Eureka discs, and Eureka did at least give us 2 ratios for this film. This also seems to be an older Universal Master, possibly what was used for the old DVD. It cleans up pretty well. It does look like an older Universal Master in terms of having some noise in the transfer and things, and you do need to expect some occasional light wear in terms of some specks and scratches and an occasional line or two, but it's relatively clean. So it looks pretty solid. I just wish there was a 1.85 option, and preferably for all of these films, I do wish they all could get new scans and masters. But for both of the 50s films here, they both look solid, even though they're older Universal Masters. Now, in terms of the audio, we have the original mono track in lossless quality here. It sounds pretty healthy and solid for a track of this age, and obviously being lower budget. There are some production and inherent constraints, it seems, with the source, because there is a little bit of distortion on the loudest music passages, an occasional light tick or two, but nothing major. And there is some harshness in some of the dialogue, but it does sound relatively healthy, and seems like how I remember the old DVD of this being when I watched it years and years ago. In terms of the supplements, we get a brand new commentary, again from Kim Newman and Stephen Jones. They provide another wonderful commentary track that's lively, engaging, and gives plenty of production and background information on the cast and crew. And they also talk about the inherent hokiness of the film, and that it still manages to have a kind of charm, even though it's goofy as heck throughout, and does seem very much designed to try and capture a certain market, and is done on such a very low budget and studio bound production and a script that is frequently dumb. So they have fun kind of poking holes in the science and stuff, but it's nice to have a commentary to immediately jump into and just try to process what you've seen again in terms of the positives and negatives inherent in this film, and coming at the really the very end, or almost the very end, with just a couple more films after this that are still technically Universal horror films. So we also have another lovely image gallery with production stills, lobby cards, foreign and U.S. poster artwork, and nicely some older U.S. VHS home video artwork. One more note about the image gallery, you do get to see plenty of stills of the different makeup I mentioned before, which seems to be like the first version monster that they just cut out of the film. The commentary discusses it a little bit. They wonder if maybe it was just a rejected makeup, but I think it was just, it may just be cut for time, or maybe Jack Arnold wanted to keep it unseen in the first appearances, but I think it was just the first version of the transformed man, and eventually I guess he was supposed to devolve further, or maybe I'm just reading way too much into this film. There's also a trailer. This is standard def, upscaled. It's not a very good quality trailer to begin with, but at least we have it here, and it's in the 1:3 ratio, so you get to see what what a vintage trailer of this looks like in the different ratio, fully opened up with a really goofy narration. But the audio quality is also not super great, because I think it's literally an old trailer scan with a really scratchy sounding optical track, but at least that's here, and it looks solid enough, and you can see how this film was sold back in the day. So ultimately, I think Monster on the Campus is a disappointing film for it still being technically Universal horror and representing the sort of last stages of the end of Universal horror. I think it's got some good ideas and some charm to it. I just think it's a shame that this is where Universal horror wound up, and this is the last genre film that Jack Arnold made for the studio. I think that's an absolute just a shame, really. And you have some really notable names working in the crew on just what is really just an odd sort of piece of product that Universal tried to crank out to appeal to the teenage market, but it doesn't quite work. But it does have charms of its own. It does have a certain hokiness for sure. So it does have its fans, and it does have some positives to it. I know I sound like I'm being harsh on it, but again, it's not a film I dislike, but it's also a film that you definitely kind of groan a bit when you're watching it. Even the commentators do, and at the exact same moments, of course. So it's kind of a shame Universal horror had petered out to this point, and we only had a last couple films come out that could even be quasi considered horror films. But this one, it's just it's very threadbare. It's very low budget feeling. It looks very flat, even though you've got a legendary cinematographer shooting it, and it was cranked out really fast, and the script is just so frequently dumb that it does hold the film back. But it at least has some charms of its own. And where else are you going to see a Neanderthal regressed man hurl a hatchet in a poor forest ranger's face, even though it's not on screen? It's a nice gory moment that you don't expect. So there are surprises here. A hatchet to the face and a 1958 Universal programmer. So go figure. So at least Jack Arnold tries to get some energy in there, and it does have its fans. And you can now view this film on Blu-ray and the Eureka set. Now to talk about the packaging and artwork, we have the lovely limited edition slipcover with the custom artwork of original imagery designed for this release. Unfortunately, the limited edition of this is sold out, but you still get this lovely artwork. You just don't get the lovely slipcover and the custom art for the digipack. This has the same matching spine design as the other Eureka releases, and the same design on the rear with the supplement list. We have the same case design with original poster artwork for each film as the other Eureka releases, and then the credits on the back. The interior artwork has Monolith Monsters artwork, the lovely disc label tinted to match the other Eureka disc labels in this series of Universal releases. There's Monster on the Campus, of course. and the Monster on the Campus poster artwork. We have a nice booklet again with new essays for this release. It is flanked by man-made monster images, and nicely they actually use the VHS artwork that I remember seeing as a kid from the classic Monster series as the artwork for the booklet front, so that was a nice touch. Now this booklet's a little bit different. Each film gets a write-up, but it's all part of a single long booklet essay by Craig Ian Mann talking about each of the films, but under a single piece entitled Unknown Horrors. So this is still laid out in the same nice style, but you get imagery and write-ups for each film and more lovely imagery as well. But still, the real standout here is Man-Made Monster. And then we get the typical Eureka technical information at the end, which does list information, of course, about the alternate ratio presentations. I just, again, wish this had 185 options. So that is the limited edition presentation from Eureka of 3 monster tales of sci-fi terror, bringing together 3 Universal science fiction and monster films that are not really often discussed unless you're talking to other fans or if you're in genre circles, and given the same nice treatment and packaging and art design as the other Universal horror sets that Eureka has done in the past. So this is another essential release if you're a classic horror or 50s science fiction fan who has also enjoyed some of Eureka's other releases, or if you're picking up the Eureka sets instead of the US releases. This is still a really lovely release to pick up. But do keep in mind, this limited edition version is now gone, but you still get the same disc contents and the standard version. You just don't have the slipcover and the poster artwork on the actual case art itself. So this is just one where the limited version has sold out. Again, I do generally think the Eureka presentations of the Universal horror titles they've been handling are better overall than the US versions, even though they lose out on the US specific extras, and they're usually more affordable than those Shout Factory volumes. However, in this case, with the 2 1950s films, I think the Shout Factory Blu-rays are important because they do give you a 1:85 ratio presentation, which I think is better because it just gives a little bit more breathing room. So this is definitely one case where for those 2 films in particular, I think it's good to have the Shout Factory Blu-rays on the aspect ratio side of things, because I think just the Universal 2.0 to 1 framing thing on these 2 films, I think they're just a little bit too tight, and they need that little bit of breathing room. And of course, if you have a large budget to spend on physical media, you can just get all the Shout, Kino, and Eureka releases of these same films and get all the extras and things, which I would love to do. I just have to think with my wallet and try to purchase what I think is the better release. And Eureka, I think, has done consistently a better job at handling these films with nicer packages, better encoding, and better overall quality presentation across the board than Shout and Kino have. And additionally, they are much more cost effective even when you're importing them. Again, these are Region B, but it is a lot easier to get a region free Blu-ray player these days. They're not super expensive, and even some UHD players have workarounds. So it's definitely doable, and I think these are still the way to go for these Universal horror films, but I just wish these had a 1:85 ratio presentation for the 50s films here. But all of this set is worth it just for Man-Made Monster alone. Don't let the short runtime fool you. That is a Universal classic. It is one of their best horror films of the 1940s, and it's an absolute gem that never fails to delight and energize audiences, with especially the Lionel Atwill performance, which is one of his best. So this is another great Eureka release of Universal horror titles. It's essential just like their other releases, and I just really love what Eureka's been doing with these. So as always, I hope my babblings about the Universal horror canon and physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you've seen any of these Eureka sets, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. These films are quite fun, but I do think Man-Made Monster is the absolute standout. I think it's one of the most underrated of all of Universal horror and science fiction films. So as always, please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.